Good evening and welcome to the spring lecture series of the Princeton Adult School. I'm Nancy Beck, a board member and a member of your hardworking lecture committee. Before we get started, I want to tell you about something that I discovered just this afternoon. I had already written my introduction, but I decided it was too good to pass this up. Some of you may know that 2013-14 is the 75th anniversary of the Princeton Adult School. I've been looking at some of the material we have from that time, and I'm going to take a minute to tell you what I came across today. On January 16th, 1939, the first classes were held, and there was what was called the headline course. It was a lecture series entitled Problems and Prospects of Democracy. The titles of the talks all sound as if we could have it in a series today. Remembering that this was 1939 and that we have the advantage of 20/20 hindsight, wouldn't it be wonderful to know what they said? We tape these lectures today, but in 1939, all we have are titles and speakers. For example, and appropriate for tonight, New Problems of American Foreign Policy. Professor J.A. Perkins. And then another, I'll just want to give you these two. And this must have been new, the United States as a world power. Professor R.J. Sontag. What will they be talking about at a Princeton Adult School lecture in another 75 years? Now back to the present. For those of you who may be new to us, a few reminders. The red ticket you received tonight is for the whole series. Bring it each time and just show it at the door. I've already been told that I made a typo. The second lecture will be on Tuesday night, no matter what I said on here, which I believe is February 26th, not 25th. Unlike an airline ticket, this is transferable. If you can't come one night, you can give it to a friend. We call this our spring series, but we all know that it is still winter. So if there is a possibility of cancellation because of snow, it will be posted on our website, princetonadultschool.org, and on our phone line. If you wonder at all about the weather, check it out. Let's hope for the good weather, because if you think it's hard for us to schedule all these busy people in the first place, it's really hard to reschedule them. These lectures are being taped, and DVDs of the entire series will be available in the public library when the series is completed. They're also available online through our website. We have had to make one last-minute substitution. The lecture next week will be Christian Sonner, not Max Weiss. We were lucky to get a replacement who is an expert also on Syria, so the subject of the lecture hasn't changed. And finally, the mystery lecture of April 2nd, billed as See Our Website, is still a mystery. We have the possibility of yet another outstanding lecturer, but his availability is still a little iffy. But we think it's worth it to keep the slot open, and we'll let you know as soon as we know. So we come to tonight in the opening lecture of our series, Cold Facts About Hot Spots. When we developed the series, our first choice for our kickoff speaker was Anne-Marie Slaughter, and we were delighted that she was available and agreed to get us started. Professor Slaughter is Bert G. Kerstetter, 66 University Professor of Politics and International Affairs in the Woodrow Wilson School. From 2002 to 2009, she was Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. As most of us know, in her last but one job, from 2009 to 2011, she served as the Director of Policy Planning for the State Department, the first woman to hold that job, as she was the first woman to be the Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. As Director of Policy Planning, she worked closely with the top leadership of the State Department and USAID. When she left to return to Princeton, she received the Secretary's Distinguished Service Award for Exceptional Leadership and Professional Competence, the highest honor conferred by the State Department. Dr. Slaughter is a magna cum laude graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School, where she won one of the university's top awards to study at Oxford for degrees in international studies, international relations. Then she returned to the U.S. to attend Harvard Law School. Before joining the Princeton faculty in 2002, she taught at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and the University of Chicago Law School. And we know who else taught at the University of Chicago Law School. I'm not going to list or review the 6 books, more than 100 scholarly articles, boards on which she serves, or magazines which she contributes to or edits. I'll sum all of that up by noting that Foreign Policy magazine has named her to their annual list of the top 10 global thinkers every year since 2009. I think that should be enough to convince us that we could not be in better hands for a discussion of foreign policy challenges for the new administration.
Thank you. I think I can start by saying that whatever I tell you tonight, the foreign policy challenges of the next decade are nothing compared to what they were in 1939. We can be grateful for that. So it's great to see all of you. You really honor me by coming out in such numbers on a rainy February Princeton night. I had a student come to see me today. This was her first time in Princeton, and I thought, this is not our best, but I'm delighted to see all of you. So I'm going to talk about 5 challenges and 3 opportunities. And there will be challenges I leave out, and many of you will notice that, and then we can talk about those in the question and answer period. And these are my particular take on things that the Obama administration either has to do and has to do right away, or possibly will arise in the next couple of years and are more the curveball, the things that are not on our agenda right now. So 5 challenges, 3 opportunities. The first challenge, and it's not going to surprise any of you, I think, is Iran. Okay, I'll just keep talking and hope you do. So, you know, we've been dancing this dance with Iran for a long time now, for almost a decade, in terms of their efforts, we say, to not just to peacefully enrich uranium, but in fact to enrich uranium for the purposes of getting a nuclear weapon. And we think that is their ultimate aim. They say, no, they have a right to enrich uranium, as they do, under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that it is solely for peaceful purposes. Now the problem is we've been going back and forth and negotiating and not negotiating and threatening and telling them that all options are on the table and sanctioning. We now have incredibly tight sanctions on Iran. And one thing the Obama administration has done has been to assemble a remarkable coalition, a coalition that includes Russia and China, includes Europe, which gets a lot of its oil from Iran, includes Japan and Korea, again, purchasers of Iranian oil. So the economic pressure is very tight. The Iranians are going to have another election this summer. There's good reason to think if we're ever going to get a deal, we ought to get it. It needs to be before the election, because then all bets are off. But also our own credibility is on the line, right? We keep telling them that they have to stop, or we have to negotiate a deal, or all options are on the table. Now, I think the next 6 months are really a critical period. Indeed, in October, I would have told you there was a better than 60% chance we might actually strike. I'm not so sure of that now, but I still think we are essentially trying to move this toward the end game. To do that, we're going to have to reach a deal. We're going to have to reach a deal that probably neither side likes very much. We're going to have to acknowledge that the Iranians can enrich uranium, certainly to 5%. We don't have much problem with 5%. The problem is 20%, because at 20%, which is the enrichment up to the medical isotope level, they can go very quickly from that level all the way to the level necessary for nuclear weapons. So the question is, I'm certain the deal will include their moving a good bit of the uranium they've already enriched out of Iran, so that we think that they have less available actually to enrich further. But we might actually end up having to agree to their enrichment all the way up to 20%. They, of course, would have to agree to complete transparency of various kinds, as well as destroying some of what they've already done. Watch that space. We are trying to negotiate with them bilaterally. We're also negotiating with them through what we call the P5+1, the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. Those negotiations are led actually by Cathy Ashton, who's the head of the EU. But here's the part that I think many people don't think about. many of you, we read about Iran, we think about Iran getting a nuclear weapon. Many of us, myself included, think, well, even if they got a nuclear weapon, we could almost certainly contain them. The Ayatollahs are not crazy, right? They know that if they actually tried to use a nuclear weapon, they would be obliterated. And that form of deterrence was dangerous, but it worked very well for a long time during the Cold War. But that's not, I think, what worries President Obama. And you actually heard this, if you were listening carefully, in the State of the Union speech. What worries him is that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will try to buy a nuclear weapon from the Pakistanis. The track record should give you cause to worry if the Saudis wanted a nuclear weapon. If that happens, Turkey is likely to think it needs a nuclear weapon, and then Egypt. So what he's worried about is precisely a domino effect in the Middle East. And he's worried about any new country actually getting to a nuclear weapon on his watch. Right? We're watching North Korea. They got nuclear weapons. They're still testing them. Once that starts to snowball, you're looking at a world with possibly 30 countries with nuclear weapons. He came into office preaching the global zero, a position advocated by George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and Sam Nunn and Bill Perry, Secretaries of Defense, Secretaries of State. A position that says we need to move toward a world with no nuclear weapons. It's going to take us a while to get there, but it's the only way we can actually assure our future. Because if it's a choice between no nuclear weapons and 30 states with nuclear weapons, they're going to get used, either through terrorists or accidentally or deliberately. So the reason I emphasize this is that he's been talking again about the global zero. He said it in the State of the Union address that he wants much deeper cuts with Russia. He knows he's not going to obliterate our nuclear weapons by 2016. That's impossible. But he wants to put the world on a path, like arms control with the Soviet Union, that has a logic that moves toward fewer nuclear weapons rather than more. Which is why I say, watch that space, because I actually think we would be prepared to take action, which means some kind of strike, if we can't get a deal this time around. That's the first challenge, and it's a big one. The second is in the news every day and just gets worse and worse and worse. It's Syria. A year ago, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said we should be arming those groups that are, in fact, willing to sign a declaration of pluralist principles and abide by human rights. I said, if we could arm them, it would help tip the balance of power, and it would ensure that we were, A, helping the Syrian people who think we have completely abandoned them, and we would have more power in an ultimate transition. It's a year later, 70,000 Syrians have died, 2 million are refugees. You have a country in the heart of the Middle East, the most volatile region in the world, that is breaking up into pieces. And when it does, you will destabilize Lebanon through the Alawites on the Lebanese border. You'll destabilize parts of Turkey and Iraq with the Kurds. You will destabilize other parts of Iraq with a Sunni insurgency that will again fuel the Sunni counter attacks in Iraq itself. And even Jordan, which is plenty fragile these days, is already hosting far too many refugees. And if Syria comes apart, there's a danger there too. Not to mention, of course, whatever might happen with Israel. We cannot afford to let that happen. On humanitarian grounds, absolutely not. On long-term grounds, we have another generation of young Arabs growing up believing that all the United States cares about is Israel and oil, when we had, in fact, a chance to actually stand with them. These are people who marched for 9 months, taking bullets without firing back, and we have not been able to help them. But fundamentally, we cannot allow this to happen strategically. For the price of oil, for the stability of the region, for being enmeshed in troubles there for decades to come. Today, the administration, it was leaked that they are reconsidering their policy. I'm deeply concerned that it's constantly too little too late, that now we will think about arming groups that actually look like we can support them, but by now the other groups that are being armed by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are quite inimical to our interests, are already too strong. So But we have to do something, and what we do will also, again, help determine where we are with respect to the broader Middle East and the continuing Arab revolutions. So that's Syria. So you notice that although the Obama administration wanted to pivot to Asia, the Middle East didn't letting us go, right? We are still deeply committed there, and what happens there is still enormously important to us. But the third challenge is on the other side of the world. The third challenge is in Asia, and the way I would frame it is not territorial disputes over islands. That is the spark, but the deeper problem is rising nationalism among young people in China and among older people in Japan. Right? So you have a situation where a small incident could erupt into a much bigger conflict. The worst moment I had in government was the night that the Japanese captured the Chinese fishing captain. Now, the Japanese and Chinese governments didn't want to go to war. But, you know, we didn't want World War I after the shooting of the Archduke in Sarajevo either. Right? What happened was things escalated. All that had to happen was some Japanese patrolman at sea fires a shot, or Chinese fires a shot. We are bound to come to Japan's defense. Right? If Japan actually ends up in a conflict with China, we are in a conflict with China. So that volatility, it's not about the governments. It's about what could happen at the local level. Somebody gets trigger happy. Somebody decides to earn themselves a promotion. They capture someone. They fire a shot over a bow. They ram another boat. And the two governments get themselves into a situation where they can't back down. And then we're involved. So, you know, we're doing everything we can to defuse these issues and to talk about multilateral solutions. But in the meantime, it's China and Japan that I worry most about. But there's also Vietnam and China. Obviously, we're not directly involved there. We're not allies with Vietnam, but that could be dangerous. The Philippines, once again, that's a treaty ally. And the Philippines have every reason to kind of poke the Chinese in the eye, knowing that we're right there. So a lot of our work right there is to actually kind of talk down the temperatures in the region. That's the third challenge. The fourth is one you're not going to read about, and I don't know when it'll happen, but I raise it precisely because we don't read about it. And it is the end of the Bolivarian Revolution in the Caribbean and Latin America. In other words, Chavez, who may well be already dead, and nobody knows. My Twitter feed has a lively betting game on whether or not he's still alive. You know, that picture we saw today with the two daughters, you know, could have been taken any time in the past year or two. He will not be here very much longer. And the Castros, even though they're defying all predictions, they really can't live forever. Cuban medical care is really good, but if it's that good, then we should all be moving. So when those two things happen, that's really significant, right? I mean, if you look at the Caribbean already, it's an enormous source or destination for foreign investment. It is the sea that connects us to Latin America, just as the Mediterranean connects Europe and Africa. If you imagine Venezuela, once again, having good relations with us, with all of its assets, and then stabilizing Central America, the sort of semicircle that goes from Caracas all the way to Miami, and then Cuba here, all sorts of things could happen. Right? It's really an enormous set of possibilities for economic growth, for knitting together societies, but it's unlikely to go that smoothly, right? And there's quite likely to be violence in Venezuela when the Chavistas actually, when Chavez dies and they try to maintain their power without him. I mean, already in November there was an election and the opposition came quite close. The minute Chavez dies, they'll try to reassert power or to demand a new election. So there could well be real violence there. And of course, with Cuba, nobody knows. Again, it's unlikely just to sort of have the Castros die and then they open up. So I predict in the next 4 years, we're going to be spending a lot of time on that area. And I will say that we were in government, it was July of 2009, so about 6 months, and there was a coup in Honduras. Honduras is a small country. We spent 4 months trying to work out the results of this coup unsuccessfully, I might add. We're invoking the Organization of American States, trying to do everything we could to get the person who committed the coup to stand down, let the original ruler come back, and then have elections. We failed, but it took a lot of time. That's Honduras. Now imagine what I'm foreseeing with Venezuela and Cuba. So I would watch our own hemisphere. Lots of things could happen. The last challenge is it's not a surprise to any of you. And it is what the president mentioned in his inauguration speech, and it was very significant that he did. It is climate change. It is the gravest security threat that faces all of us, directly and indirectly. Directly, we went through Sandy. We know, if we look at, Mayor Bloomberg, like the head of Singapore, like the head of Amsterdam, like cities all over the world are looking at rising sea levels and thinking about how on earth they're going to protect against that and the weather that comes with it. That part's evident to all of us, and for our children and for our grandchildren. And my children, it's very interesting. They are genuinely frightened. I look at this and I think, as I was in the 60s, I thought nuclear war was a very distinct possibility in ways that my students now just can't possibly imagine. My children imagine that environmental cataclysm is a very distinct possibility. Right? They have seen enough, read enough, and been told that in their lifetimes this is what you can expect, that they see this in very real terms. But the other reason it's such a challenge for us is the place that probably worries the most about it in Washington is not the Environmental Protection Agency, although they are very concerned. It's the Pentagon. If you want to see scenarios of what climate change is going to do, you go to our military, because they look at creeping desertification, flooding, basically unlivable conditions. They give rise to the oldest conflict in the book. My land is no good. I move. Very rarely in human history have the neighbors said, come on over, we'll share. That's not the way it works, right? That creates enormous conflict. And already you can see it, and I mean, it was part of what happened in Darfur. It's part of what's happening across the Sahel. The people do not have, the land can no longer support the populations. It's part of what's happening in Syria, right? Syria went from 5 million to over 20 million in quite a short period of time, and the land can't support it. Yemen may be the first country to actually run out of water, as in really run out of water. The water table is dropping so fast, and the population is growing so fast. What happens when that happens? They're not going to stay put. We will have conflicts all over the place, and we are worried that we will either they affect our vital interests or we get drawn into them. So when I talk about climate change as a challenge, it's a challenge for all of us here, but what happens globally is every bit as important. All right, now that I've cheered you up, you can imagine why poor Secretary Clinton used to say, her reading lists range from terrorism to global pandemics every night. It's a very challenging world. Let me give you some of the good news, and then we can open it up to questions. So the first good news that I think is really great news is that I think we are going to forge a stronger, deeper, and better transatlantic partnership. For all the pivot to Asia, the Euro crisis has had one very salutary benefit. And I say that it's had a salutary benefit because I'm half Belgian. My husband's half Hungarian. We have spent much of the last 20 years trying to convince Americans that the EU really does matter. It is the largest economy in the world. Every time you read the New York Times and you see us #1 and China #2, you should think, no, EU #1, we're #2, China's #3. That's what the CIA fact book says. Right? The EU is the largest economy in the world. It is China's largest trading partner. It has 500 million people. It is a group of democracies. It has 70,000 troops deployed worldwide, which is not peanuts. Right? And if their troops weren't deployed, we would have to be. Guess who went into Mali? Guess who went into Libya? Those were not our troops. So we spent a lot of time trying to do that with limited success because the EU is not sexy and it doesn't have the kind of growth that makes people excited like Asia does. But the Eurozone crisis has concentrated the mind. It has convinced Washington that if Europe goes under, we really do have a problem, right? Because we are incredibly densely intertwined with Europe. The flows, the investment flows, the trade flows across the Atlantic are far denser than anywhere else in the world. And together, we have over 50% of the world's GDP. That's not nothing. Even in an age of rising Asia, that's not nothing. So when the president announced that we are going to start talks on a new transatlantic trade and investment partnership, that was a very important move. And it was a real move because they've been running the traps on why the previous efforts to create a free trade and investment agreement with Europe have failed. And there have been previous efforts. And not surprisingly, they crater on things like chlorine-washed chickens and GMOs, right? They crater almost always on food issues of various kinds, agricultural subsidies, but various others. But we know where the sticking points have been. And this time around, we've checked in advance whether the Europeans think we can actually get through them. And remember, the European leaders are desperate for growth. And they really have no more tools left. They can't use monetary policy. They can't use fiscal policy. Trade is about the only way they can hope to really spur their economies over the shorter term. So I really do think we're going to see a transatlantic trade and investment agreement, and more importantly, even I think you're going to see a renewal of real collaboration in the way we do engage Asia. As Secretary Clinton says, we're not pivoting from Europe to Asia, we're pivoting with Europe to Asia, which is only smart. I mean, if you go to Shanghai and you talk to the American Chamber of Commerce, the business people will say to you, the Europeans are eating our lunch. And what they mean by that is Europe practices regulatory politics. They go to Asia, China, other places, and they say, here are the regulatory standards you should adopt. You know, here are the plugs that you should use. The kinds, all the different standards for different products. If they adopt EU standards, they don't adopt our standards. If we work together and we can agree on common standards and we can then engage the rest of the world together, and again, Europe is the EU is China's biggest trading partner, I think that's a very positive development. The second part of that is also a South-South Atlantic dialogue that is growing between Brazil and West Africa. Not all that surprising. Again, Africa is growing 5–6%. Many countries in Africa. Brazil is in a stall at the moment, but looking very good. And if you look at the energy flows, they are enormous, both north-south, both Africa, Europe, and Latin America and us, and then transatlantically. So I actually see us over the longer term, now I'm talking 10 or 20 years, heading toward a whole Atlantic basin that is a very powerful economic actor and that is increasingly integrated in various ways. The last thing I will say about that is, look at our own population. The Hispanic Americans will be the largest plurality by 2050, right? Many of us, I'm a great example, I'm half Belgian, right? Many of us were half European or of European stock, and not surprisingly, we have very close ties with the countries that our ancestors came from. Well, when the United States is plurality Hispanic, we're going to have much closer ties with all the countries that their ancestors came from. So the hemispheric integration is very important. So that's the first good news. The second is the energy boom. And here we can talk about fracking, we can talk about the environmental problems. I have many friends that are deeply, deeply worried about them. I've also recently had a conversation with Daniel Yergin, who's one of the world's foremost authorities on energy, who was on President Obama's year-long commission to look at the environmental dangers of shale oil and shale gas. And he is convinced that, in fact, these are entirely manageable problems. I'm not taking a position, I'm just relaying it. What I can tell you is the power of the amount of natural gas that we are already extracting and using and will continue. We are likely to be an energy exporter by 2020, certainly by 2030. That doesn't mean we won't have to import, but it means we'll also be exporting. Already, we have changed the global price for natural gas. It's lower in this country than elsewhere in the world, enough that it's already leading us to challenge Russia as the world's largest natural gas exporter, and enough so that it's already affecting our competitiveness, and in a very positive way. It's also acting as an investment magnet. Here, the Europeans are not exploiting their shale gas for environmental reasons, and again, I'm putting this to one side in terms of prediction. That means a lot of European countries companies are investing here already, because they already see the impact this is having. I was just in Munich at a conference. There was our Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources laid out all the facts. The head of Royal Dutch Shell laid out a bunch of facts. The story was so compelling that at the next panel, the Brazilian foreign minister, he's very smart, he's a little prickly, he's very proud. He said, I think it's important to remember, in light of the last panel, that the established powers are not sinking powers. That was a lot for a Brazilian to admit. That's not the narrative we've been hearing. We've been hearing, we're going down and they're coming up. No longer, right? So from our point of view, and again, how we do this, how we're able to do this safely, I think is definitely an open question, but there's a lot of good news on the economic front in terms of what's already happening. So that's the second opportunity. And the third and the final one I'll leave you with this evening is, I think, I didn't say this a month ago, I'm saying, I think I'm seeing a slight sliver of light on the Middle East peace process. So the president's going to Israel. It'll be the first time he goes to Israel. And of course, they are dampening expectations for all they're worth, as they should. Right? The last thing you want to do is say, well, I'm going to Israel and we're going to bring back a Middle East peace process. We've done that a million times. But he wouldn't be going to Israel, in my view, right now, if he didn't think something had changed. And the results of the last Israeli election were very important, right? The party that came in second is a much more moderate party. It's a centrist party that is mostly focused on domestic economic issues. We didn't pay much attention, but because we had Occupy Wall Street. But what was going on in Israel 2 years ago, the social justice protests, you had 300,000 people out on the streets of Tel Aviv about social justice, about the price of housing, about the fact that the burden of military service is deeply unequally distributed because Orthodox Israelis do not have to actually serve. Those issues are starting to trump the security issues. And that means there's a party there that Netanyahu can actually ally with, and there may just be a chance to finally get some movement. The Israelis know that everything's changing dramatically around them. They know that the Palestinians could launch a nonviolent Gandhian-type movement that would make life very, very difficult for them. They also know that having some security in what is now a very unstable region would be very important. So I'm not predicting Middle East peace, certainly not this year, but I do actually think this process may just get restarted in an important way. So I've left you with 5 challenges: Iran, Syria, nationalism in East Asia, particularly in Japan and China, the end of the Bolivarian Revolution, and the drowning of us all. Enough to go on for now. And then we've talked about opportunities, a much deeper transatlantic partnership. I should also say I think we're going to pursue trade agreements in the Pacific as well, which are important, but really coming back to a very important base for us, the energy revolution and the economic consequences. One very important thing I didn't say about the energy revolution. Remember how OPEC transformed geopolitics. I mean, I'm just old enough to remember the lines, right? I mean, suddenly, you couldn't get gas. They took forever. I was about 12 years old, and it was really the first world event, I think I really registered. And the natural gas revolution is going to transform geopolitics every bit as much, for the simple reason that liquefied natural gas can be exported by ship and not by pipeline. That suddenly means if Russia tightens the gas on Ukraine or Georgia or anywhere else in Europe, anywhere that has natural gas can simply export it via the Baltic Sea or anywhere else. Suddenly, the pipeline the leverage that major energy exporters have had is much, much reduced. And that is going to change geopolitics with respect to Russia, but also with respect to a number of countries that have a lot of gas and that will just be coming online. Countries like South Africa, Indonesia, Argentina, actually. So that's the second great opportunity. And then I leave you with a fragile sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, we will see a resumption of serious negotiations toward Middle East peace. Thank you very much. How much time do we have for questions? Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do that. Right there in the middle.
Best news of JP is that the Pentagon is very worried about climate change.
Yes.
I wonder whether that may help the more conservative elements to start taking this more serious. And yet, in your same wonderful talk, you are excited about natural gas becoming much cheaper. And is not cheaper energy a very bad thing in terms of suppressing other more desirable forms of energy? Not that gas is so terrible, but there are better ones that are being pushed out. So will you comment?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, the Pentagon may have some influence with some senators, right? Possibly. Although I have to say that the forces of opposition, I'm not sure are really amenable to reason. I'm going to get myself in trouble, but that's a fact. So I actually think more likely that it's very important that Obama said that in the second inauguration, right? You never heard climate change during the campaign. I mean, it just was invisible. But Sandy really changed things. I think Sandy, on top of Irene, on top of other weather patterns, I think people, you know, I always talk to taxi drivers. I travel a lot, and I always sort of take the pulse. And people are really connecting violent weather patterns and with what they know about what's been predicted in ways that I think has opened real political space. I also think this is the second administration, and he's determined to make something of it. But you ask a very important question about natural gas. So the good news is our emissions are down to our 1992 levels, our overall carbon emissions. And that is partly the recession, but it's partly using gas, which has much lower emissions than oil. But, as you point out, it's still carbon, right? It's not wind, it's not renewables, I mean, it's not solar, it's not renewables. So the real question is, do we have the wisdom and foresight, and that is a very big question, to use the breathing space afforded us by what is already a natural gas revolution? I mean, it's already taking place. To then allow us to get the economy running again such that we can start to actually make the transition, which is an expensive transition, but a necessary one, to renewables, to really subsidizing, to taxing gas and oil as we need to do, but we cannot do while the economy is this low. I think that's the intent. I think President Obama wants to start there. It's going to be an enormous fight between the climate change environmentalists and who initially think this is a very good thing, but then longer term, want to turn to renewables, and the folks that are much more worried about the safety of the water supply and land. So you're going to see splits in the environmental movement. But I trust overall we will have the sense to use this as a breathing space and not as a solution. Not sure I reassured you given your assessment of human nature, but that's the best I can do. Yeah, over there.
Every analysis I've read about the idea of attacking Iran says that people like Brzezinski and even the Mossad security chiefs are that it would only incur disaster. No good outcome with an attack on Iran. So what is the point of it?
The point of it would be to ensure they don't have a nuclear weapon. I don't disagree with you. I've read those analyses, and I'm, honestly, in general, my view has been very similar. You know, this would be a disaster. You know, we would take the most pro-American country in the Middle East, and young Iranians are deeply pro-American for the very simple reason that their parents are deeply anti-American. A dynamic I understand daily with my teenagers. But so you would suddenly, of course, have them rally around the nationalist flag. You would create in the rest of the world, once again, we are bombing a Muslim country. It would be, and of course the Iranians would try to retaliate in all sorts of ways. All of that is true, and I think the president certainly understands it, and this is not something he would want to do. But I think if we get to the point where we think that if we do not stop them, they will have a nuclear weapon. What I was pointing out was he sees this well beyond the Middle East and well beyond Iran. He sees this in terms of what would happen throughout the Middle East and then more broadly. And that, I think, the advantage would be, yes, you make a real mess with U.S.-Iranian relations in the Middle East, but you would have made clear that no other country is going to get a nuclear weapon. By the way, we're never going to be able to enforce that unless we are serious about reducing our own armaments, right? We also have to demonstrate that we really are serious about cutting our own armaments. They're over the side.
Cybersecurity as one of your threats, but it's something that some of us face.
Yes. Every time my computer jams, I think. My office used to run U.S.-China strategic dialogue. What's going on here? So look, it is certainly a threat. I'm not sure. You know, we know all the scenarios, and in terms of being able to really bring the electronic lifeblood of our society, from banks to hospitals to the computers that run utilities, you name it, to a halt. I have read a number of studies that say that's not actually that likely, that it's much more kind of a constant dance where, look, we're out there probing too, right? It's not like we don't have cyber weapons as well, we do. We are actively using them. Other people are actually actively using them. I think, here's one way to think about it. You're not going, at least from another country, let's put aside, we'll put aside terrorists for the moment, but for another country, the kind of nightmare scenario that we hear would be a declaration of war, right? And it wouldn't just be cyber war that we would respond with. And we have the means to respond, and we've got backup systems. So I actually think that kind of broad-based society comes to a crashing halt. If we were in a conflict, this goes back to what I was saying in East Asia, if we were in a conflict, God forbid, with China, then yes, cyber weapons are going to be used, and it could be awful. But in terms of worrying about a sort of surprise cyber Pearl Harbor, I don't think the chances of that are very high. What terrorists can do is an enormous concern, but that's much more likely to be local. Again, not a good thing, but much more likely to be around a specific utility or a specific, obviously the thing we worry about most is air traffic control, something like that. And there, all I can tell you is we're working very, very hard, and we do have superb technology, right? I mean, we are well established in terms of the nature of our technology. There.
Would you talk a little bit about the potential for rogue elements getting their hands on nuclear weapons, either they have them or pretend to have them, and using that to start a war on purpose?
Well, again, this is one of the reasons the president worries so much about multiple countries, particularly in volatile areas, having nuclear weapons, is the more countries that have them, the greater the danger that they will fall into terrorist hands. And certainly already with North Korea and Pakistan thus far, they've provided assistance to other states, but you worry a great deal. I mean, I think that is what the president sees as the #1 threat, is the combination of terrorism and nuclear weapons. But we have, I don't think somebody could pretend to have one. That's the first thing. I really don't think that would work. I mean, I think we've got good enough intelligence and good enough ways of knowing whether or not that was remotely credible. if someone, I think the much greater likelihood is it something like a dirty bomb, right? That it wouldn't be a complete nuclear weapon, but that somebody would get hold of enough uranium to be able to create a real threat. And there, you know, drones obviously give us much better surveillance. They have all sorts of other problems, but you know, I think that is a live threat, but I don't worry about sort of nuclear blackmail. And the last thing I'll say is, thus far, even Pakistan, I can't speak to North Korea, but there seems to be a recognition that letting this out of state hands would be a very, very bad idea. Yeah.
How do you see North Korea pushing back?
North Korea, you know. Well, so a couple things. One is that we did actually find a weapon that worked against the North Korean regime under the George W. Bush administration. We found the bank accounts that the North Korean regime uses to fund its very lavish lifestyle, and we choked them off. And we brought them back to the table. Now, it was so effective that China was very worried. China's always very worried that North Korea is going to implode, right? And that China's going to have to deal with all the refugees. So China actually wanted us to loosen up. But we do have weapons that are very direct. And I think, you know, if we really thought that North Korea was actually going to strike in some way, we would take a very different position. For now, we don't like it, but we basically think only China has the kind of leverage that can really change North Korea's behavior. And China is not worried enough to overcome its worry of what would happen if the North Korean regime collapsed. So I still don't see anything other than a very unpleasant stalemate. But, you know, he's a young ruler, and we also don't know to what extent he's buying himself credibility by pleasing the military and actually wanting to loosen up in ways. I mean, the fact that Eric Schmidt went to Pyongyang is kind of interesting, right? I mean, that's, what we also know is that young North Koreans who are on the Chinese border know what's happening in China, and many North Koreans have thumb drives. Right, so the thumb drives are like the Xerox of the Cold War, where they actually have more and more information about what's happening elsewhere, and then that, of course, could start a different dynamic. Yes.
What do you see about Cuba and the possibility of normalizing the relationship?
Well, I think it's a generational issue. I mean, in other words, I think young Cubans in Miami, or Americans of Cuban extraction, feel quite differently. I think there are many, many, many people in the foreign policy establishment who think that would be a far more effective thing to do than continuing an embargo. But Florida is a very important electoral state. So until that shifts, but it's shifting. It's just a question of whether it can shift before the Castros die. There were hands over there. Yeah.
What do you think about China and climate change?
That's a very interesting question. So one of the things I didn't say is I was telling you where the deposits of shale gas are. And I mentioned Indonesia and Australia and South Africa and Ukraine and Poland and France and Argentina. China is one of the biggest ones. There are enormous reserves in the Gobi Desert, in the deserts in the west of China. Now, there's no way they're going to be able to get those by fracking. There is no water, right? And it would be disastrous. They couldn't even try. So, but that's one issue, you know, and this goes back to your question, that amount of additional carbon, still better than coal, and they're building, you know, one coal plant a day, but not good for the longer term. So that's, I just put that there, they're very interested, right? They've got lots of oil companies out there prospecting. On the other hand, I really do think the Chinese government understands deeply that they have to find alternative sources of energy. I mean, again, I lived in Shanghai for 9 months. Shanghai will be flooded very quickly. But also desertification, right? They have it in both directions. So I honestly think independently of any kind of climate change agreement, China is doing everything it can to invest in renewables and to find ways to actually find cheaper but also less carbon emitting energy. That said, they're only up to the point that it doesn't destabilize the Communist Party. So I wouldn't say that that's enough, but I think the dynamic is growing in the right direction. Yes?
With respect to the opportunity you identified about a new transatlantic
the opposition of the Tea Party to the way they went off on light bulbs, do you have opposition? Again, do you have a political will in Congress to create those standards?
Well, it's going to be a long, slow process, but I do think a couple of things. One, we need to remember that big trade agreements can be passed as executive agreements, and then they only require a majority in both houses rather than 2/3 of the Senate. So that's something, because that's definitely, and who knows what will happen in the midterm elections. But second, I really do think here you've got very favorable political wins, because normally when we conclude a trade agreement, we conclude a trade agreement with a country that has much lower labor or environmental standards than we do, and so the unions are very upset. The unions would be thrilled for us to come up to European standards, right? I mean, their labor standards are so much higher than ours, and their environmental standards. So that whole wing of the Democratic Party is no longer opposed. So you've got the Democrats, and then you've got a lot of business. Right? So you've got at least part of the Republican Party, which means that's one reason I think we're pushing it. I think the political mavens in the White House have looked at that and said, this is a better shot than we're probably going to have again. Doesn't mean there won't be opposition, but that it could be overcome. Yes?
Beyond sheer hope, when you talk about our using the gas as a breathing space, what gives you any confidence that this country is capable of not only policy planning, but policy execution over a multi-decade period of time? It seems to me that mostly we do things when our hair is on fire.
But I think our hair is going to be on fire more and more and more. I really do. I mean,
But do you expect it to come from governmental action or from private industry, or what would you see as a scenario to make that transition?
Well, so, I mean, the way I would look at it, if right now we had the kind of taxes that Europe does on carbon, and in fact, you know, we could impose a carbon tax and solve a good number of our deficit woes as well. So there's another way of looking at that. So if you had that, and then you had much bigger and sustained support for renewables. Because of course what happens is, you know, the price of oil goes up and then it makes sense to invest in renewables, and the price of oil sinks and then it doesn't, and we've done this quite a lot. But if we had a sustained, if we were willing to raise the price of carbon and then support it, then I think you really do have the technology, you know, in sight. Most people say it's not tomorrow, it's over a course of decades, but that we really are on a path toward renewable. And people I respect, you know, nobody's given up on fusion, right? I mean, if you talk about the age of energy gases, you start with natural gas and then you gradually move to other gases, including fusion. So the reason am I optimistic? I'm not pessimistic, is that I think the crises are just going to continue. And I don't think it takes very many Sandys for people to think, wow, this is real. I mean, so Bloomberg's looking at seawalls, right? And he's thinking about what happens when the next one happens. You know, and then we have this historic snowstorm. You know, if that had been a hurricane, I mean, it was a hurricane, it was just a hurricane with snow. I think those patterns are just going to continue. And of course, the other thing that we're all terrified of is if you look at the rate of melt, you know, in the Arctic, and you really, you know, the nightmare scenario is that you get all that fresh water and it reverses the Gulf Stream. And then all of a sudden, all bets are really off. So we hope we don't get there, but I think there'll be plenty of crisis to go on. Yeah?
Has there ever been an institutionally supported diplomatic effort to promote the marketing of heavy water reactors to Iran, which use essentially unenriched uranium?
Not that I'm aware of. It's a very good question, you know, again, I think this is where the Iranians are completely right to say, look, you know, we have the right to have peaceful nuclear energy. You know, we signed the treaty, we can do that, and we need different kinds of energy for our own population. Our oil won't last forever. So it's a good idea. I cannot imagine, though, in this country, the marketing nuclear energy and Iran in the same breath. But I understand the thought. Yeah.
Just getting back to Syria, I think that's what you started with. Looking at the track record of America policy from Korea to Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan doesn't seem to be, as far as I'm concerned, a great track record. So to ponder the idea of interfering with a Middle Eastern country that's at best unstable, I can't see how you could, I could see it on a humanitarian level, but on a political level, very unstable, don't know what the results are going to be. You could be up and up, you could be in there for years. I'm just very concerned about the fairness, especially in the Middle East where we already don't have a great reputation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and actually, this is one of the tragic ironies of Syria. Syria is here we have an entire population coming to hate us because we haven't intervened. Whereas, you know, obviously, for the past 4 or 5 decades, it's been the reverse. But I would offer you a different set of precedents. I don't disagree with the ones you offered, but I would say, you know, let's look at Bosnia, let's look at East Timor, let's look at Kosovo, let's look at Libya. These are all places where, and let's look at the Kurds in northern Iraq, where we intervened with a very light footprint, no ground troops. I would absolutely not support American ground troops anywhere in the Middle East, and it didn't in Libya either. And I think what we have learned is absolutely when you're on the ground, you know, you then own what happens, and you go from liberator to occupier in about a month. I do think we've learned that lesson. I think Iraq and Afghanistan are the last 20th century wars. I really think that from that, but when I'm talking about something very different, we could, in a single strike, destroy Assad's air force on the ground. Right? We have that capability. He is using those planes and helicopters to send cluster munitions into crowded urban areas and do horrible things. But what I'm talking about is intervening at least enough to stop him with some of his weapons of destruction. I might well be willing to go for serious mortar emplacements as well, but only from the air. And really, the point is to try to tip the balance of power within Syria so that the people who are still supporting him realize the game is up. Because we've been saying now for almost 2 years, oh yes, well, Assad can't last. Well, Assad is lasting, and the longer he lasts, the more people dig in, and the more, frankly, they're afraid of revenge killings, rightly, right? So what I want is some use of military force to make clear that we are prepared to use it, accompanied by very intense diplomacy. And only with regional support. I would not do this if the Turks and the Qataris and the Jordanians and the Saudis are not on board. I don't think we can get the Iraqis. And only if they had actual skin in the game as well in terms of actually being willing to use force and diplomacy. But there, I think, we have learned that with strategic and careful use of force, we can, in fact, genuinely help the outcome such that in Kosovo and in Libya and in Bosnia, we are heroes. You know, when Secretary Clinton went to Kosovo, there's Bill Clinton Avenue down the main street. She was mobbed like never before. And even in Libya, which has no good reason to love us in terms of various things, our ambassador was killed, but tens of thousands of Libyans marched in the streets in protest. And that's not happened anywhere else in the Middle East. Yeah.
Many of us consider North Korea to be a noisy distraction that sooner or later will self-implode. What's the next noisy distraction?
Well, I can tell you the State Department would be very happy to not have it be a noisy distraction. I mean, that's a really good question. Well, many people would probably say there is a pretty substantial danger in Pakistan. I'm more optimistic than many people. I actually think the Pakistani, there is a democracy there. It is, you know, there are deep parts of the Pakistani culture, not the parts we typically read about, that I think are quite resilient. But that would be one. Many people say any of the Central Asian states are likely to be the next to go. Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan particularly, I've heard, I mean, they already had a lot of domestic instability. I will be quite candid and tell you I can name them, and I can find them on a map, but I don't think any of us know, or except for real Central Asian specialists, know enough and are watching enough to really be focusing until something happens. But people who are expert in that area tell me there's a lot of instability. There's obviously no legacy of strong civil society or anything else, and that you could get some very nasty things happening. If somebody asks me a question, I can add, last question, I can answer cheerfully.
And one more, and then
Up
I'll.
to the-
What do you think the Eurozone will look like in 5 years?
Ah, that's a good one. I think it will be very strong. I think it will not have lost any countries, and it may well have gained a few. Interestingly, the French have just announced that they are dropping their opposition to Turkey joining the EU. This is very significant. Of course, Turkey right now is no longer quite so sure it wants to join. So it goes, but if the EU admitted Turkey, imagine its reach in the Middle East. I think this is not lost on many Europeans. But I really do think that the construction of Europe is the equivalent of the founding of the United States in the 18th century, right? We were the first country ever to solve the problem of a large territory, this is Madison and Federalist number 10, that could be ruled democratically, and it was a federal state. And other countries like Germany, Canada, many others, Australia, are federal states. And the federal state solution was the political science solution of its time. Today you have the problem of 200 states in the world. Many are far too small to really survive on their own, but they're sovereign. They got their own languages, their own flags, and they're not interested in giving those up. So what Europe is an experiment, just like our founding fathers had an experiment, to see if you can knit together countries in ways that give them the economic benefits, the labor benefits, the geopolitical benefits, while still preserving those independent cultures. So Italy's still Italy and Sweden's still Sweden. And I think we've seen it. I've bet for the Eurozone at every occasion in the last 2 years or 3 years, where every economist, Paul Krugman tells us daily it's done for. It's not. And the Europeans, not only that, they weren't willing to let Greece exit. Right? There were a million reasons to let Greece go. I mean, it's a tiny percentage. You've had lots of trouble. No, they were not going to let it happen, because to let it happen would start to unravel the idea of Europe. So I say, watch that space and watch other regions look not to a federal state model, but to a regional integration model as how we solve the political science problems of the 21st century. Thank you all.